Okay, so back to this. Um, where does our law come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, right? So there's a couple of sources of authorities. And so the first source of tax law authority is called primary authorities. These are come from three different areas. Those are statutory sources, judicial sources, and then administrative sources. And so, as far as statutory sources are concerned, the says here the Internal Revenue Code. Well, where does the Internal Revenue Code come from? Well, um, it comes from Congress. Now, Congress does not recreate when they make a new tax bill like they're talking about doing now. They're not going to rewrite the whole tax code. Okay, they're going to rewrite various parts of it, but any parts that are unaffected by the new uh, tax laws are unchanged, and so it's not like you throw out the old and in with the new. And so right now, our uh, statutory source of Internal Revenue Code is the Tax Act of 1986 or something like that. Um, Judicial sources, that's our courts. And so the courts interpret what the Internal Revenue Code was, how it was meant to apply. And then you have your administrative sources. I mean, the main thing here is the fact that the Internal Revenue Code, when you look at a certain section of the Internal Revenue Code, it's fairly vague. And so the IRS's job is to interpret statutory intent, Congress's intent, in passing a certain section of the Internal Revenue Code. Is their interpretation always correct? No, it is not. And so we have our courts as the final arbiter, uh, usually in what a particular code section means. But if there's not a judicial source, then the IRS, their interpretation of a particular code section is what stands, barring some judicial decision to the contrary. All right, so those are your three primary authorities. And so when you're dealing with the IRS and you want to cite a particular authority, you want to cite primary authorities only. Okay, those things have meaning. Those things have the power of law behind them. But what if you have a client who has a tax situation on an issue that you know nothing about? That happens, or you know very little about it, and so you have to do some research on this. Um, well, probably the first thing you're going to do is do some background reading. And so these secondary authorities are a great way to find these uh, unofficial um, publications that are going to help you figure out what the law means. So, tax services such as CCH Master Tax Guide, the one I'm familiar with, which is very good, is the RIA Federal Tax Handbook. Of course, all this stuff is now digital, so it's not really a handbook anymore. Also, you can have other types of tax articles. So, anything from a law review dealing with the tax matter, tax journals would be considered articles. Those are secondary authorities, but it's a great way to, get up to speed on a particular issue. And these tax services, what they do, they incorporate um, a lot of different things from a lot of different areas, and so you can uh, it gets you while it itself is not primary authority, it can lead you to primary authorities on your issue. All right, so note here the Internal Revenue Code. The main part of the Internal Revenue Code that you need to be familiar with is the particular code section that is at hand, is in issue. And so here they have Internal Revenue Code section 162E to uh, capital B, small I or 1 is what that is. So, you're mainly focusing on the particular Internal Revenue Code section that's at issue. Some other things that you could have to help you understand a particular code section are committee reports from the Senate and um, House of Representatives, Finance Committee reports, House Ways and Means reports, things like that. And what that helps you do is get some background information on what Congress is intending to do by passing this particular code section. As far as administrative authorities, your IRS interpretation, you have proposed regulations, you have temporary regulations, and of course you have final regulations concerning a particular code section. And so they would be noted as such in the citation. And then you have something called revenue rulings and revenue procedures. These are second in administrative authority after regulations. Unlike regulations, though, these rulings address the application of the code and regulations to a specific factual issue. And so usually what happens there is a taxpayer will submit a particular fact scenario to the IRS before they actually do the transaction, asking for advice on whether or not this particular way of structuring the transaction so that they know that if they do this transaction in a certain way, it's going to have a certain tax effect on them and not something different. Okay. And so these revenue rulings, revenue procedures, uh, look allows the IRS to look at the fact situation, uh, determine whether or not they agree with the taxpayer on the tax treatment of this transaction, and so it gives the taxpayer some certainty when they're dealing with complex transactions and the tax effects of them. Now, although these revenue rulings are binding on the IRS, a court may agree or disagree with a revenue ruling, although they usually give them quite a bit of deference. Now, revenue procedures usually deal with certain issues, how to do certain issues, and they're usually more detailed than regulations, and they explain in greater detail the IRS practice and procedures in administering the tax law. And you have a couple others there, private letter rulings, as well as technical advice memorandums. U.S. Supreme Court, of course, is the highest law in the land as far as authorities are concerned on the judicial side. And so there's some citations applicable to the Supreme Court, and then some applicable to circuit courts. And then there's what a U.S. tax court regular decision would look like. And they have something called memorandum decisions, which are usually shorter in content. And then there's a district court case citation as well. Now, why do you have different citations for a U.S. District Court case? Well, because different publications, different citations for different publications. That's all it boils down to. Secondary authorities, again, there's different types. If you have a chance, RIA is probably the best as far as tax research services are concerned. Not cheap though. You have some newsletters. Law reviews are a great source for tax issues, as well as professional journals. So here they ask, which are primary or secondary sources. I think I give you a problem like this. U.S. Constitution usually doesn't give you, I mean, it's a statutory authority, but it usually, it's definitely what the Supreme Court and all other courts look at as far as the constitutionality of certain things. But it doesn't really provide much as far as interpretation of tax code goes. So, I mean, any tax code changes have to be made under the authority of the U.S. Constitution. All right, so, organization of the Internal Revenue Code. Again, the main thing we're looking at here is going to be income taxes, and so that's going to be your chapter. But what's really going to be the thing that you're going to look at is the sections. So here you have 3 sections. Section 61, gross income defined. Section 62, adjusted gross income defined, and Section 63, taxable income defined. So again, we're mainly concentrating on the section number. Now you may remember, whoa, trying to get back here. Here we go. One thing to point out here as far as the courts are concerned is this judicial doctrine of stare decisis. And so when I talk about precedents, uh, this judicial doctrine of stare decisis is in play to determine what is precedent. And so all courts apply the judicial doctrine of stare decisis. That means that the court will rule consistently with its previous rulings and the rulings of higher courts that have appellate jurisdiction over that court. Now, as far as tax court is concerned, again, these tax court judges may hear a case in Florida 1 week, and they might hear the same exact case scenario um, in California the next week. Well, what if the circuit court that has jurisdiction over the California case ruled differently than uh, the appeals court who has jurisdiction over the California case? What does the judge for the tax court do? Well, they have to follow the highest court's decision in that particular case. And so in the Florida case, they would look to whatever circuit court is above them in the Florida court for their ruling. And if it's different, then let's say they go next week to California, and the Ninth Circuit rules totally opposite of what the circuit court that over Florida did. Well, they've got to rule how the Ninth Circuit Court did. And so what that is, that's called the Golson rule, and it just means that the tax court has to follow the higher court ruling in the jurisdiction, well, whatever higher court has jurisdiction over the taxpayer. And so if your taxpayer's in California, you look to the Ninth Circuit for stare decisis, for precedents. If your client's in Florida, the tax court judge is going to look at whatever circuit court of appeals has jurisdiction over Florida. I can't remember. It's like the 11th Circuit or something, or 10th Circuit, 11th Circuit, something like that. All right, again, we're not going to handle tax research. Understand that if you are a tax professional, what is a tax professional? Well, in our case, it's someone who can represent clients before the IRS. And in our case, mainly we're dealing with CPAs. And so 3 types of persons can represent clients before the IRS. The first is an attorney. The second is a CPA. And then there's a third category called an enrolled agent. The first 2 are pretty obvious, but the main thing is we're talking about CPAs. And so if you are a CPA and you represent clients before the IRS, you have several different governing bodies looking at you, and certain rules of conduct and ethics are involved here. The first one, if you are a member of the AICPA, is you're subject to the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. You are also subject to the standards for tax services issued by the AICPA. On top of that, the IRS has issued Circular 230, which issues or explains some of the obligations by tax professionals. And then on top of all that, you have your state board of accountancy statutes that deal with ethical situations. And so, you know, what happens here if you get crossways with a client and they report you, or the IRS reports you? Well, you could be in a heap of lot of trouble with a lot of different groups, the AICPA, the IRS, and most importantly, the State Board of Public Accountancy in the state where you have your license. And so, you know, failure to comply with statutes and the rules, ethical rules, can result in you being admonished, suspended, or barred from ever practicing again. So you have to be real careful when you do this stuff. You could be, if you don't follow the rules, subject to penalties, civil penalties, and criminal penalties. And so the most common is, of course, civil penalties. These are monetary in nature, and they're imposed when taxpayers and or their practitioners violate the tax statutes, and they do so without reasonable cause. Now, tax practitioners and taxpayers could be subject to criminal penalties. Normally, though, especially for tax practitioners, that's not usually a problem as long as you're not part of whatever the fraud scheme is. You know, you don't want to ever have that kind of situation going on. But, you know, could happen to your taxpayer client, but you don't want those kind of clients anyway, right? So, I mean, there's some differences, some similarities, a lot of similarities actually between the different things, like the statement on standards for tax services. Um, you know, if you look at them on Exhibit 2-11 on page 25 of Chapter 2, talks about different things like tax return positions, answers to questions on returns. So SSTS number 2, answers to questions on returns. A tax professional should make a reasonable effort to obtain from the taxpayer the information necessary to answer all questions on a tax return. SS, and I'm just taking some examples here. SSTS number 4, use of estimates. Unless prohibited by statute or rule, a tax professional may use the taxpayer's estimates in preparing a tax return if it's impractical to obtain exact data and if the estimate amounts appear reasonable based upon the facts and circumstances known by the professional. departure from a position previously concluded in an administrative proceeding or court decision. Tax professional may sign a tax return that contains a departure from a previously concluded position in an administrative or court proceeding if the tax professional adheres to the standards under SSTS number 1. So if you go back up there, says a tax professional should comply with the standards, if any, imposed by the applicable tax authority for recommending a tax return position. If the tax authority has no written standards, the tax professional may recommend a tax return position or prepare or sign a return when she has a good faith belief that the position has a realistic possibility of being sustained if challenged, or if there is a reasonable basis for the position and it is adequately disclosed on the tax return. So that just kind of gives you a flavor of what you got there. All right, so that's it for chapter 2. And we're going to skip chapter 3 and we'll go on to chapter 4. Chapter 3 deals with tax planning. We're going to skip over that chapter, but we will discuss throughout the chapters in the future. We'll talk about different tax planning techniques, strategies when we're dealing with certain issues in future chapters.